Okay, so the next hour we'll do initially it was called Ethereum Deep Dive, but as I was putting the slides together, it was really just scratching the surface. And so what I am trying to convey in this part of the lesson is more information about kind of the blockchain ecosystem. And so first of all, I want to point out a few resources. And there's, we already kind of covered a few of them, but so CoinMarketCap and CoinGecko are two sites that give you essentially price information, historical price information, where you can trade tokens for essentially all tokens. And let me just briefly show it to you. You see kind of what are the trending tokens, largest gainers, and then essentially it's sorted by market cap. And once you kind of go down the list, then you also may encounter some tokens that are less common. But you always find in the markets tab where you can trade them. Not all tokens are traded everywhere. So that's CoinMarketCap. Glassnode is a blockchain analytics site that give you insights on on-chain metrics. So for instance, you can get information about, hey, are the whales, and whales is a special term. Whales are essentially holders of a lot of cryptocurrency. So think of kind of the early investors or very rich people. You can see what they're doing on chain if they're not disguising it somehow. But and so you can see, hey, are they selling? Are they buying? And there's a whole slew of metrics that Glassnode exposes. A DeFi Llama we already looked at. So that gives you information about kind of what the TVL for the various chains. And then you can deep dive into each chain and understand what are popular protocols based on the TVL that they have. So TVL, total value locked. And then even here you can see, hey, so Aave, for instance, exists on multiple chains, whereas QuickSwap only exists on Polygon. CryptoPanic is a good site. It's essentially a news aggregator. From a variety of sources, there are a whole bunch of news sites that dedicate themselves to crypto news, but CryptoPanic is an aggregator, so it's a great resource to look at as opposed to individual sites. And people are able to kind of upvote, downvote news stories, and so you kind of get the hot news stories. If you think about security, in terms of resources, OpenZeppelin's smart contract library and wizard. So these are pre-audited libraries. They're secure libraries that you're able to use when you create your own smart contract. So let's assume you want to create a token. You don't need to write up the code from scratch. You go to the OpenZeppelin smart contract library, configure it, and say, hey, I want that, and then it'll generate that. Forta is the real-time threat detection monitoring solution that I work for. Ultimate DeFi Research Database. So this is a huge resource by Officia CIA. So if you, after this course, decide that you want to go into blockchain security, this is a great resource with tons of research and articles to deep dive into a variety of blockchain security topics. If you are inclined to hack, you can, of course, exploit protocols, and then you're on the run because the government will try to catch you. Or you can be an ethical hacker and work for protocols. And Immunify is essentially a bug bounty program where if you identify a vulnerability, you report it to the Immunify platform, they will report it to the protocol that is affected, and then there's going to be a payout. And let's look at what the payouts are. And so if you find, for instance, a vulnerability in the wormhole bridge, you can earn $10 million. So just look down the list. I mean, these are all big bug bounties. And there's hundreds of them. If you're looking for a security community, there's a couple. So Spearbit and Code4Arena are decentralized communities that focus on smart contract auditing. So smart contract auditing is essentially the process where the protocol creates a smart contract, right? And then they will send that to an auditor like OpenZeppelin to essentially review the code in great detail for any sort of vulnerabilities. And most protocols go through that process. Smart contract auditor rates are extremely expensive. So think of like $1,000 per hour. That's what they charge. And they have so much work, they're not able to handle it all. And so there's these decentralized communities that have emerged. So Code4Arena and Spearbit that are essentially loosely organized security researchers that perform smart contract audits. So you can go to a centralized auditor, or you can go to one of these communities. And of course, these communities are more welcoming for people to contribute. So if you want to become a smart contract auditor, that's a great way to get involved. And of course, these organizations is all part-time, as opposed to if you work for a centralized company, they're all full-time.
They don't mention them and then later on kind of thing. Because you don't like know, you don't really know these people, right? Company.
Yeah, so Code4Arena, I think it's more of a bounty. Whoever finds a bug gets a prize, whereas Spearbits is more traditionally structured in terms of auditing, but it is tiered, where you have essentially, junior auditors that do auditing, and then there's senior auditors that review. So it's not that just one auditor does it. And so there's some checks and balances to prevent that sort of abuse. But great question. I think yes, you do have to apply, but there's generally a security shortage, like of people that do this sort of work. And so if you take this course and study up on how to do smart contract audits and kind of demonstrate that you're kind of learning the subject, I'm sure they will welcome you with open arms, and then of course invest in training as well. Connecting with the crypto community, very different than like a traditional company. A lot happens on Twitter, crypto Twitter. A lot happens on Discord and Telegram. And then, of course, the various security conferences like ETHCC, which always happens in Paris, DEF CON, which is more rotating, so next week in Bogota, and then Bitcoin conference, and I think that's always in Miami. And kind of the cultures of these conferences, it ranges. Some of them are really about mostly party, and then others are really about, hey, let's get together and build cool stuff with hackathons and workshops, etc. If you go to a crypto conference, there's a tip: you don't necessarily need to have a ticket to the conference. Now, of course, if you want to go to the conference, then you have to have a ticket. But there's usually a lot of side events, both on the social side as well as kind of side workshops that are usually easier to get in. And how do you get the invites for those? You have to be involved in the crypto community, Discord, Telegram, Twitter, etc. Generally, I think the crypto community is very welcoming. It's decentralized and open. And so if you want to become involved, you can become involved. So it really just takes your initiative and then you can get involved. Basically, if you want to get involved in a project, review their documentation, join their Discord, and see how you can help out. And there's many pointers that you will get. Okay, next, what I want to talk about is L1, L2, and sidechains and bridges. So L1 is something like Ethereum. It's a blockchain that stands by itself. L2s are blockchains that speed up transactions, maybe at lower transaction costs, that don't necessarily run on the Ethereum blockchain, but there's a mechanism that allows to have the same security guarantees as the L1. So if you bridge your Ethereum to something like Arbitrum, that is an L2, your assets are as secure on Arbitrum as they are on Ethereum. That is very different from side chains or even other chains. These are essentially self-contained chains that have maybe a different consensus protocol, that have prioritized different aspects of the blockchain trilemma. But again, depending on the use case, it may make sense to use the sidechain. And the example that I given when we talked about this was if you are dealing with large financial assets, you prioritize security. You want to have something like Ethereum, and it is fine that a block gets mined every 15 seconds. And you're fine with transaction fees of $50 a transaction. But if you're doing gaming, play to earn, Axie Infinity, that wouldn't work, right? But then, security is not as important, but throughput and transaction cost is. And so that's why you have all these different chains. Bridges are a set of smart contracts that allow you to transfer assets from one chain to another. And let me explain how that works. That is very important. And today we have seen an example where that didn't work out. So we have Ethereum. And then let's say the Ronin bridge. And bridges allow you to take, so this is mainnet. It allows you to take ETH and send it to another chain. Yep. The way that works is your assets get actually locked in a bridge, a smart contract. So basically, let's assume I want to send one Ethereum. I will deposit it to a smart contract on Ethereum. And then over here is another smart contract that resides on the other bridge. And it essentially monitors that other smart contract. And it will see, hey, I deposited one ETH. And so what that then allows me to do is withdraw an ETH on the other chain. Now, one thing that you have to remember is that that ETH and that ETH is really not the same. Because over here, the ETH is on Ethereum, meaning it is secured by the Ethereum network. Whereas the Ronin bridge is essentially, the Ronin bridge is the bridge that, well, there's a Ronin network. So it's the Ronin network. The Ronin network is used for gaming, for Axie Infinity. And it has 9 validators. How many validators on Ethereum? Yeah, 400,000. So the security over here is very different than the security over here. Yeah. And so just because it says ETH right here, doesn't necessarily mean it's ETH. It is valued as ETH, but it is much less secure over here than over here. And these bridges have billions and billions of dollars locked in. I think the Ronin bridge had $3 billion locked. So think of that smart contract as $3 billion of assets. And that makes it extremely attractive targets for attackers. And so let me continue. The Ronin bridge got hacked earlier this year for $560 million. And the way the attacker did it, they got control of the 4 validators that secured the Ronin bridge. And then the bridging usually happens in 2 directions. And so basically what they were able to simulate is I'm depositing, you know, 1 million ETH here, right? Because they controlled 4 of the 9 validators, that the majority. They were able to fake essentially, hey, I'm depositing 1 million ETH here. And then they were able to withdraw 1 million ETH here. So they were able to drain essentially this part of the bridge, that smart contract. Obviously, there was no 1 million ETH deposited here. They just kind of simulated it. And then they were able to drain 1 million ETH from that side of the bridge. And that was $560 million.
Like, there are 9 validators on, so like, ETH is its own mainnet, and the Ronin network is its own blockchain. Just wrap stuff up, maybe faster. So do they have 9 validators, and how do you, is it open in terms of like Ethereum's like anyone can join the network? Is the Ronin network the same way?
No. The Forta network was controlled by 2 or 3 companies. The validators were 2 or 3 companies. Now, that's right. And let me Duke mentioned earlier during the break. Today, the Binance Binance chain got hacked in a similar fashion. And with Binance, it's also about $500 million. And what the Binance chain did, so Binance is a centralized exchange, but they also have a chain. They turned off the chain. So if you think about what the promise of blockchains is, decentralized, permissionless, censorship resistant, I would say that's the case on Ethereum mainnet. But it's not the case on Ronin, it's not the case on Binance. So just because it says blockchain, there's a range in terms of how people interpret what a blockchain is. And in my book, it is decentralized, it's secure, it's permissionless, and censorship resistant. So I personally would never send ETH to a chain like that, because secured by 9 validators.
So they're not like, they were just company partners, so isn't that just, isn't it just like someone's, like a couple of members want more money, and they go over there, took the money and benefit thing?
A good point. Good point. I mean, there could also be, I mean, Yeah, there could be collusion, could be insider activity too, right? And so, I mean, that's actually an important point, that you don't want to rely on the security by trusting the developers, right? It should be secure independent of what the developers do. If there's a malicious developer, if there are many malicious developers, it should be robust against these sort of attacks, right?
For the credit of proof of work and the B2C paper, basically there's a whole variety of what they call civil attacks, which is where you have a disproportionate influence by pretending to be many people. So it was like I don't know, a famous Greek person that had like deity or something. So Ethereum has that problem, especially whereas when you do proof of work, you automatically protect against that. Having more IPs doesn't give you any advantage, just computational power does. So
that's right.
People doesn't give you any ability to collude with yourself or with others.
That's right. In terms of kind of the blockchain infrastructure proof of work, you have to have the computational power. So more IPs don't help. In proof of stake, the same. You have to have Ethereum staked. And so those are both mechanisms, proof of stake and proof of work, are mechanisms to protect you against civil attacks. Because otherwise you could just spin up a whole bunch of nodes and then you suddenly have, you know, more nodes, like 51% of the nodes, and then you can perform actions like here. Let's talk about nodes. So, talked about let's say the Ethereum network. So these are all full nodes up here. And if I am a client, let's say on my machine, assume I use a wallet that connects directly to my local node, then I basically create an RPC connection to one of the nodes. So remote procedure call connection, which is basically just like I'm connecting to it, and that allows me to programmatically interact with the node. And then I can, sorry, I'm just looking on whether I have that on the next slide. Then I can basically say, here's my transaction. I'm sending you my signed transaction, right? And so then it goes to the node, and then it gets distributed amongst the network, ends up in the mempool, and gets money. So that's one way I can submit a transaction to the Ethereum network. And the software, the node software on Ethereum is called Geth. There is many more implementations, but Geth is probably the largest one. You can run a node on your machine right now. And there is, again, the different types of nodes, the light nodes, which are just the block headers, the full node with kind of the state information, and then the archive node. I think it has kind of like some historical information. As I mentioned, full node, you need a 2 terabyte SSD card. It has to be SSD because there's just a lot of disk I/O that is happening. And if you spin up a full node, if you're connected to a gigabyte internet connection, it will take you about 1 to 2 weeks to sync. Takes a long time. People don't want to do that. And the alternative is go to an infrastructure provider called, and there's many out there, Infura and Alchemy are kind of the biggest one, at least on Ethereum. And they basically run nodes for you. And then you sign up for the service and you get an API key. And then that allows you to connect to essentially to their nodes. And they will allow you to, connect, I don't know, a few thousand times a day. If you connect more, then they start charging. And so with that, I would ask you to sign up for an account on either Infura or Alchemy, unless you want to run a Ethereum node. Yeah, you did. So let's see whether you can get an API key. Yeah, an API key. And so let's see here, where is that? Yeah, you basically go to create an app, you name it, you give it the chain, you give it the network, and then you create the app, and then over here, it's going to give you a key. So here we have basically the key as well as the the RPC endpoint. So I think when I'm back from Bogota, we will connect to the Ethereum chain programmatically. And so for that, we need this endpoint. You all got one? Okay, no worries, Duke. Yeah, and you have a European plug or a Vietnamese plug, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry? I don't know where you see that. Oh, hang on, create an app. I only see name, description. And then, okay. And again, for testing purposes and kind of development, the free account totally fine. And then there's even down here some code then on how to connect, and we'll go over that in an upcoming lesson. All right. That's right. You can either do it directly through the node or these infrastructure providers. And the just deployment of a smart contract is really just a transaction. Where you say, here's my smart contract code, it's coming from me. I sign that and send that to the Ethereum network, and then the nodes understand that, hey, you're creating a smart contract, and they will create it for you, the miner. No, I think the smart contract deployment is based on the size of the smart contract. If you're a crappy programmer and your smart contract code is not very efficient, then the users of your smart contract will have to pay a lot of gas when they interact with your smart contract. Okay, so accessing blockchain data. So there is a variety of ways you can do that. You can do it by accessing a node directly, or go through one of the infrastructure providers. And what that allows you to do is read raw blockchain state, and it allows you to create transactions, or rather submit signed transactions. The shortcomings of this approach is you interact with the blockchain one block at a time, right? So now let's assume I want to find all transfers from Maria to Mark in the entire history of the blockchain. If I use a node, then I basically have to go through every single block, look at every single transaction, and look at the from address and the to address to find all the transactions between Maria and Mark. That will take months. And it's also going to be expensive if I use an infrastructure provider, because now I'm making a ton of requests. So that's one way. Block explorers, and we already seen Block Explorer, like Etherscan, is essentially a graphical representation of blockchain data that allows you to explore it. And as they kind of ingest blockchain's data, they curate it in a particular way. So for instance, they will see Mark's account, and then they will kind of start indexing it in a particular way. So if you then are interested in all of Mark's transactions, you can easily do that. And we, let me go back to the Block Explorer to show you how that looks like. Nope. So we go back to Mark's account. So here you see two transactions, one from the faucet going to Mark's account, and then to a second account, right? And these are two transactions in two different blocks. And as you see on the UI here, it's all there. But if you go to a node directly, you would have to go through all the blocks to get that information. But block explorers are still a little bit like one block at a time. And that brings me to the last way to access blockchain data is through analytics services. And these are essentially services that index the blockchain data and put it into a set of tables that you then can query. So you could say something like, give me all transactions where the from address is Mark's address. And then it's a simple SQL query and you get that data. So it really depends on what you're after. So you have to think about your use case, and we'll go through a few examples to kind of bucket your choice. Mark? Yeah, I mean, yes, it is expensive, but I mean, it's not like, I mean, it's a large amount of data. Think of it as, 2 terabytes is what a full node has. Maybe it expands it by 10x because they index it in a certain way, right? So it's not out of the impossible. But if you use something like Google BigQuery that basically charges you of all the reads and writes, when you issue a query to some of these services, it can get very expensive. I did some queries and $200 for a query. I was not pleasantly surprised. Only after, really. I mean, it's so cryptic on some of these services. They say like every 10 bytes you read, you pay a cent. And I was like, I don't know how many bytes I read with this query. So it's very, very challenging. But that's Google. Dune is more of a dashboarding service. You pay a subscription fee. It's, I think, $400 a month. And then Luabase is a new service that is coming online. Their service is still free, and we'll use that. But eventually they will probably charge as well. I think this should be pretty familiar. So transactions, you have a client that has a transaction, they sign it locally, right? Then the client sends that transaction to the network. by, let's say, connecting to the node. The net transaction gets distributed in the network and ends up in the mempool. And then you have one of the nodes, the miner that picks it up from the mempool, it executes the transaction, and then the state changes. State of the blockchain changes. That should be all pretty familiar, right? Oh, okay. So now what we're talking about is gas. So when the client submits the transaction, it basically says, I am willing to pay X way for gas. So it basically just says, I'm willing to pay this much for a transaction. And then when the miner pulls from the mempool, it will pull the transaction with the highest paying transaction cost, because that's what the miner will get when they mine the block and execute the transaction, right? So they're economically incentivized to maximize their profit. Now, why do you think there is gas to begin with?
Yeah, used to prevent the transaction to be executed like indefinitely. So basically, for Ethereum, the smart contract language is Turing complete. So for it to be complete, the program it face a problem, the floating problem. So there will be like instructions that will not stop. So I think that they invented the gas to like to actually stop the program since the payer of the transaction cannot like have infinite ETH trade options.
That's exactly right. So it's really around like, let's make sure that the execution of the transaction will not be infinite. And I think the second aspect of gas is, again, kind of an economic incentive, right? Because otherwise there wouldn't be any miners. The mempool is publicly visible. So you have, transaction 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you have essentially a miner reward associated with each transaction. And that mempool is publicly visible. What do you think is the problem with that? Yes. I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
The low payout transactions will get stale and may stay in the mempool for a long time.
That's right. That is certainly one issue. What other issue?
Yeah, so the which transactions they want to go front and they just pay on east to get higher.
That's right. So the transactions are publicly visible. I can see, hey, transaction 2 makes a profit. I can go in and analyze the mempool, and then I submit a transaction with a higher miner reward, and then my transaction gets executed first. And I make the profit. And the person that submits it first will not. FLASHBOTS are think of it as a separate network that is essentially a private mempool that is not part of the Ethereum protocol. And so miners can integrate with the FLASHBOT network directly. So basically the way it works is I have a transaction, I sign it, and I don't submit it to a node. I rather submit it to the FLASHBOT network. The FLASHBOT network then integrates with the miners directly, and my transaction will contain a sub-transaction that will pay the miner a particular fee. And so what that gives me is privacy. Because now my transaction no longer is in the mempool. I will promise that basically the miner to pay him directly. The privacy is only temporary, because of course, when the miner picks up the transaction and mines it, then it's publicly visible on the blockchain. But it is basically the few seconds that it sits in the mempool, that is no longer happening with FLASHBOTS. And a lot of attackers use FLASHBOTs because, again, and arbitrageurs are using FLASHBOTs because they're essentially concerned of front running, right? So think of an attacker that attacks a protocol, $560 million. They don't want anybody to like looking at my transaction in the mempool and then front run me, and then I lose $560 million, right?
Thing you're talking about?
I think you should think of it more as an L2, but I don't even think it's a blockchain per se. Basically, a miner would have to integrate with the FLASHBOT network. And even as a validator, you can basically run a little piece of software that's part of the FLASHBOT network. And then basically, as you pick transactions, you look both in the mempool and then in the FLASHBOT mempool, essentially.
Just specify that I want my specific transaction to go through this network.
That's right. That's right. Okay, gas. So let me explain gas. So gas is a unit that describes how expensive an operation is. And then there is a cost associated with it, price per gas. So if like an ERC20 transfer costs 21,000 gas, and if the price is 10 Wei, which is essentially a unit of Ethereum, then the transaction cost is 210,000 Wei. If the network is really busy, the gas doesn't change. The gas is essentially constant based on how expensive it is to execute your transaction. But what can change is the price per gas. And so if the price per gas goes up, let's say 20 Gwei, then you have ERC20 transfer cost 420,000 Gwei. The price per gas is determined by you as the user as you submit a transaction into the mempool, and you can basically say, hey, I want to have my transaction mined very quickly, and so I pay more gas. Or I'm like, hey, I can wait a week for that transaction to get mined, and then I pay less price per gas. Now, one thing that happened a few months ago is they kind of changed the way the transaction fee is distributed. It used to be that the entire transaction fee goes to the miner. Now there is essentially two portions of the transaction fee. There's the base fee, which is essentially the Gwei that cost here 10 Gwei per gas. And then there's a priority fee. This right here stays constant based on how busy the network is. or it changes on how busy the network is, it's not something that you can set. What you can set is the priority fee. And what happens with these fees, it used to be that all of that fee goes to the miner. Now the base fee gets burned, essentially thrown away, and the priority fee goes to the miner. And what that has done to the Ethereum network, it has tremendously decreased the inflation on the network. And we can look at that real quick. Oh, what's going on? Oh, man, I thought, oh, it's probably because, of course, because of proof of work. Well, anyway, what you would have seen that essentially the issuance of ETH has decreased after this change. Yes, Oleg? Yeah, it was, I think it was a little bit more dynamic. So it kind of hooked up to the Ethereum network directly. It basically calculated it on per second basis. Yeah, I think it's the same. The base fee gets burned, and then the priority fee gets to the validator. Okay, I have 2 more slides, and then we'll call it, just to kind of have a good stopping point. The transaction and the smart contracts get executed on the Ethereum virtual machine. It's a single entity while it is distributed. It maintains one state, which is the Ethereum mainnet state. And the EVM is what defines the rules for computing a new valid state from block to block. As I explained to you, like when a smart contract executes, it's essentially the current state plus the transaction gets executed, and then it creates a new state. And there is, what you would expect in a virtual machine. There's a program counter, there is stack, there's memory, and then in this case, there's also gas available, which is special because of kind of the halting problem that we talked about earlier. Okay, so this is kind of the last slide that I want to go through today, is because it relates to gas. So Solidity code is essentially the language, one of the languages that smart contracts can be authored. And when you compile Solidity code, it gets compiled into bytecode, which are essentially the low-level operations, right? Like there's an opcode for adding, for multiplication, subtraction, division, for storing memory, for reading memory, for, yeah. Those are kind of the main one, and there's many, many more. And so when you compile the smart contract, right, it then looks at a series of bytecodes that gets executed when you invoke it. And every single instruction has a cost associated with it. So as you see here, an add costs 3 gas, and a division costs 5 gas. That's how gas gets calculated. So it basically executes a smart contract, and for every single transaction, it's basically, there's just a lookup table that says, hey, this instruction costs 3 gas, next instruction costs 5 gas, and it adds it all up. And that's how gas is essentially determined. And so if you have a transaction with a lot of execution, you have to pay a lot of gas. And if you have a transaction with little execution, little gas. Excellent question, because you do not. Because if you think about loops, right? You don't know. A loop could execute 10 times or 100 times, right? Now there are basically when you submit a transaction, MetaMask is trying to calculate, guesstimate how much gas it will take, but usually you don't know exactly how much. And so when you submit a transaction, you should think about paying a little bit more or providing a higher gas limit when you submit the transaction, because what happens if you run out of gas? So let's assume you submit 21,000 gas as the gas limit and your transaction would be 30,000 gas, then it fails. And then you paid essentially for nothing because your transaction failed, but you still paid the transaction fee.
There is the RPC that can help you simulate the transaction if you get the estimated gas. Yeah, gas is that is given is not the exact. You will have to actually like execute the transaction. After that, you get.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereas Ethereum is very complete, BTC can do the same thing as long as you can do it primitive recursive, which means that all loops have to be unrolled, which means you have a really large code size. But you still have to solve the same gas problem. Because obviously, you know, you have a finite amount of memory for your code size, you can send it, and you know, you're gonna know, I guess you'll know app compile time roughly, depending on what machine is doing what with your code, I guess. You'll definitely know how many operations your code will do. So is there an analogy for gas in Bitcoin?
To be honest, I don't know. I'm not too familiar with kind of the smart contract framework on Bitcoin. But it's not Turing complete. It is much more limited than Ethereum. But I would assume, I mean, there's transaction fees, and I'm sure there's transaction fees with kind of the smart contract or scripting capabilities on Bitcoin as well. But I'm not sure how that gets calculated.
It's also more stateless. How much stateless is smart contracts?
As much as you want. Now,
Later you can call a function that just changes the variable, right?
yeah. Now,
So you-
storage. Ethereum, you can store state, but one thing to keep in mind, storage is very expensive. So there's an opcode that says, I'm writing memory to permanent storage. That's going to cost, I don't know, 20 gas. So that's why, again, looking at the Merkle tree, that's why we use it, to optimize for gas. Yes. Well, I mean, you can store raw bytes. You don't have to store hashes.
Actually, it's hashed and duplicated around all the nodes, right?
Yes.
And that's how they have the value. They have the hash transaction.
No, the transaction and the state is separate.
Okay.
So think of the state as essentially the memory that is associated with the Ethereum virtual machine. Think of it just like a memory on your machine or your disk drive. That's what the Ethereum virtual machine has access to. And to write and read, it costs. So you want to be very careful on how you store data and how you access data.
If you're running an Ethereum virtual, how much memory do you need to hold as much stack memory as everyone's using at a given time?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a ton. Like, again, you're working on a blockchain, and so there is not as much, well, again, memory storage is expensive. And so think of, again, kind of the example that I mentioned in terms of the Merkle tree and the allow list, right? You could store 50,000 accounts in your smart contract, or you can store one hash. All right. Thank you all. Sorry for going over a few minutes. And